friends, comrades, everybody back to another episode of the Parmenius podcast. Here as always in the new kind of podcast studio in the Center for Innovation and Research. Thank you to Mauricio, the producer, and Mary for kind of facilitating, first of all. And here as always with Bernard Wills. How are you today?
Mm-hmm. Good.
Professor Bernard Wills up at Humanities, Grenfell campus as always. So we're very excited to get back into kind of the intellectual thrust of like the summer. This is like how we like to spend our summers, and we're really thrilled to have a guest who's made a lot of noise online about things that we're really interested in ourselves, and we're happy to have him on. Matthew McManus, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah.
Awesome. Matthew is the associate professor now of Spelman College, a new association or a new a new move down to Atlanta. We're looking to maybe ask you a bit more about that, but Matthew's also written for all kinds of publications, Jacobin, Current Affairs, Liberal Currents, a new piece he's written, Rawls in the Streets, The Political Right and Equality is one of his books, and one of the books we're interested to talk to you about, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. So, yeah, wonderful. Thanks for being on the podcast, Matthew.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. Like I said, I'm Canadian, so it's always nice to talk to other Canadians.
Mm-hmm. You're talking from across the border, of course.
Yeah, in the enemy territory, as it were.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate it. Thanks for the dispatches. So getting into the book, core thesis of your book is, in my reading of it, liberal ideology. It's based on a tradition of liberal political theory that is a lot more robust than apologia for capitalism, imperialism, elitism, this kind of thing. And that it can be much more easily aligned with kind of the socialist principles given proper retrieval. So maybe we can start with that kind of disambiguation. Can you tell us a bit about that project?
Sure. Well, one of the motivations behind the book was I share a lot of the wariness of liberalism of my left-wing comrades, right? But, when we were getting conversations late at night, sometimes very late at night, I would ask them sometimes, like, do you really think that freedom of association isn't important, or freedom of expression? Do you really think that the state should have a say in dictating people's religious views? And of course, the response that I would always get is, absolutely not. We're very committed to those kinds of principles. If anything, we're more committed to them than people who call themselves liberals, which may very well be true in a lot of instances. So an aspiration of the book was to kind of make explicit why it is that so many leftists remain committed to many aspects of liberalism, even if there are a lot of reasons to be critical of its association with bourgeois market forms, for example. And then another major motivation behind the book was, as you mentioned, I spent an awful lot of time writing about the political right, sometimes to a fault, too much time, especially given the state of it right now. But one of the things that really comes to the fore in the great works of right-wing philosophers, people like Nietzsche and Heidegger, for example, is their insistence that actually there's a lot more in common between liberalism and socialism than between any of the viewpoints that they're putting forward on the right. And gradually over time, I came to the conclusion that people like Nietzsche and Heidegger were right about that there is this deep elective affinity between liberalism and socialism, which conciliates them more readily than any of the two doctrine is readily conciliable with the political right.
Yeah, so you start your book basically saying, well, interestingly, the most noise that was made about this book project that you proposed was from the right, saying, see, I told you so, like we all knew it was all one thing. But you're doing a much deeper thing than that. You're looking at kind of dividing, and I don't want to say, I've been trying to make sure I don't say extracting, an active retrieval of the kind of parts of liberal tradition that are more aligned with the kind of socialist left today, which people just are basically kind of closed out to seeing or to discussing. So liberalism doesn't have to be just simply a political theory or economic logic, hegemony, an ideological thing that it is today. So you're looking to try to retrieve that. So can you tell us about this C.B. McPherson, or is it C.P. McPherson, this kind of technical term that you have in your book called retrieval?
Sure. So the term is coined by C.B. McPherson, who some of your listeners might know is the great Canadian political theorist from the University of Toronto. He's most famous actually for his book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. And my book's title is a very clear tribute or plagiarization of his, if you want to be snarky about it. But, McPherson was much more than a one-trick pony. And in his essays on retrieval, what he attempted to do was to go and show that there were actually emancipatory, egalitarian, and even radical elements to the liberal tradition that he really accounted for in his work on possessive individualism, and that the left sometimes underappreciated. And one of his core examples, of course, was John Stuart Mill, who I also foreground pretty prominently in the book. A lot of people don't know this, but Mill identified as a socialist, argued for a kind of economic democracy, et cetera, et cetera. And McPherson was very sensitive to that. So what I was doing very much in the same spirit was just saying, look, without a doubt, there are many forms of liberalism that are extremely conducive or even symmetrical with support for capitalism. But here we have an index of figures who are very clearly anti-capitalist in a lot of respects, but still proudly identified as liberals. And I think that that's an emancipatory idea that's worth retrieving, and an emancipatory tradition that can be of use to us right now.
Yeah, and so you also make note of the tension that a lot of the leftist spaces will kind of delineate, right? So like this kind of, I think in a footnote to one of your pages, you say, you're too much of a methodological historical materialist to see that just ideational analysis can just purely kind of divine this out of nowhere. But at the same time, there's kind of a worthwhile ethic to be pulling out here. So normative individualism, can you tell us more about how Mill kind of places the normative individualism with the kind of social ontology that we could kind of probably look for?
Sure. Well, what I argue is a core principle of liberal socialism is a commitment to methodological collectivism and normative individualism. And to be clear, these aren't terms that I developed or even an idea that I put forward. It comes from Tony Smith, the great Marxist philosopher, in his book, Beyond Liberal Egalitarianism. So just want to be very clear in acknowledging that. But what I mean by methodological collectivism is all the liberal socialists that I mentioned recognize that human beings are social animals, to use the kind of Aristotelian term. We can only flourish effectively when we live in a society, and we can only reach our maximum potential, our eudaimonistic state of flourishing in the right kind of society, one that is well-structured and well-organized. Now, of course, all the liberal socialist authors that I talk about have a different vision of what a good society would be for individuals, but they remain normative individualists in the sense that they think that ultimately what matters is the flourishing of actually existing individual people, sometimes non-human animals as well. And we could add future generations to the list, since it's very likely that they're going to come into existence. We might even have some responsibility to make sure they can come into existence. But liberal socialists are very wary of ascribing any kind of primacy to abstract entities of the sort that, for instance, the political right tends to cherish. Things like the nation, civilization, the Volk, or the race, right? All these things that people will appeal to as a reason for abridging individual rights or dignity. We need to do this for the sake of the nation or whatever it happens to be. Liberal socialists pretty emphatically reject that for the idea that it's individual flourishing. That's what's important.
Okay.
Yeah, wonderful. I guess just on that again, so that's wonderful. So another element that you mentioned is the normative core in Marx's writing, which kind of brings us back to this tension, the perceived tension between a socialist and like a kind of explicitly Marxist kind of vision. I know you also note in your book, I think in a footnote, there is the socialist left today, like for instance, in the current affairs kind of sphere where we don't need Marx. We don't need to kind of be adherent to this. But at the same time, there is a kind of normative core of what you call the developmental ethic in Marx that is actually very like resonant with this kind of critique as well. So can you tell us more about that critique?
Sure. Well, when I was going to school, the kind of prevailing view was that Marx was emphatically not an ethical theorist, right? There was this kind of Althusserian hangover that said, look, maybe in his early works, you can find certain kind of humanistic themes that are developed, critiquing alienation or critiquing the warping of our species being. But by the time you get to, you pick your point, the Grundrisse, Capital, some people would even say as early as the Communist Manifesto, you get the scientific Marx, right? The figure who was just resolutely opposed to writing recipe books for the cook shops of the future or moralizing in some kind of utopian way. And I really think that this has had a desultory effect on the socialist movement. Because it's given rise to what G.A. Cohen, the great analytical Marxist, called this obstetric view or obstetric way of arguing for socialism, right? That a true scientific socialism doesn't need to offer ethical principles for why it's better than capitalism. All we need to do is critique power, analyze capitalism, and then, pave the way for the birth of a new society because, the new socialist society is, the inevitable child of capitalist social relations. And Cohen rightly points out that certainly by the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, this kind of obstetric view of socialism is just not plausible to anyone any longer, right? I think it's pretty good bet that capitalism will disappear one day. All things change, right? But there's no necessity that says that socialism is going to come to replace it. And so partly in response to this, there's been a renewed set of attention paid to Marx's ethical work, which I would exclaim pervades all the way up into Capital, right? Even Capital Volume 3. So people like Bruno Leopold, who wrote a really good book on Marxist republicanism, or Vanessa Wills in her great work, Marxist Ethical Theory, all kind of fit into this paradigm. But what I argue, as you mentioned, is that Marx is probably best understood as a kind of closet Aristotelian. He's essentially committed to this idea that human flourishing is what's important. And the way to ensure human flourishing is to adopt the dictum, essentially, that the free condition or the free development of each is a condition for the free development of all, right? There's this social understanding of what's required for our flourishing. And the best representative of this, I say in his late work, is in Capital Volume 3. In Capital Volume 3, near the conclusion, he says, look, one of the major problems with capitalism is very good at developing certain human powers. Think about Adam Smith, right? If you're working in a pin factory, the pin maker will make sure that you're very, very good at making the head of a pin, right? On part of an assembly line. You'll get very, very good at that. But there's not really much incentive to make sure that you're good at other things. And Marx says in Capital Volume 3, in a good socialist society, the development of human powers will become an end in itself for the first time. So we're not just developing your powers because it's profitable to do so. We're developing your powers because it'll be good for you and for those around you. And I think that this is a very attractive vision, right? He doesn't spell it out as systematically as perhaps he should. But then, Marx always projected that he was going to write 1 million books on every given subject. I think there's supposed to be 20 volumes of Capital at one point. He only ended up publishing one. So, it's up to us to kind of workshop a more mature kind of Marxist ethical theory into being. And people are doing, like I said, very good work on that now.
So I suppose then my question would be, there's a couple angles from which we can look at this problem. There is the notion of the object of liberal political philosophy as involving a notion of individual flourishing. I want to put that aside for a second because I think that there's some important problems there. But the first thing I suppose I want to note is that, when one, as a philosopher or a professor or an intellectual, enters the public sphere, the first thing one notices is that an analytic framework such as would be, assumed in a university is uniquely ineffective. Okay? And the reason is, I don't know if I figured out the reason, but I might have figured out part of the reason. There seems to be a kind of conceptual alliance between, liberalism, liberal socialism, and Marxism that's to do with material analysis. Okay? And then, suddenly in contemporary politics, you're faced with this problem. Well, if material analysis, if the examination of material conditions is so essential to understanding politics, what the hell is wrong with Kansas? Okay. And this has come to the fore, as far as I can tell, in a marvelous way with the Epstein files. Okay. Because finally, Donald Trump has made possibly the only mistake he could make. Okay, so for instance, take the girls who got drowned in the flood in Texas. Trump could have individually strangled all those girls, and it would not have mattered to his base. However, with refusing to release the Epstein files, Trump has messed with the symbolic gratifications, which are his actual contract with his voters, right? I will fleece you in the material realm, but you won't care because I will give you symbolic victories in the cultural realm. And especially, I will give you that greatest, highest symbolic good, which is retribution and revenge, right? And so here is one instance where clearly he's broken his contract with his base because he's not delivered the promised revenge. He's not delivered the public execution of Hillary Clinton on TV or any of the things that MAGA voters were hoping to see.
Stay tuned, though.
Sorry, stay tuned. Yeah, okay. I mean, I'd like to see what happens when he pardons Ghislaine Maxwell. That's what I want. But okay. So Here is an instance where goods in the symbolic and narrative order seem to have come to an unusual kind of prominence, which puts in question, at least, the adequacy of a purely material analysis of politics. And by the way, the second example of that I have would be with anti-vax conspiracy theorists, right? Because if you pay attention to them, actually, they have a hold of a core liberal principle, which is personal autonomy, right? I do not want to live under a narrative constructed for me by Anthony Fauci. I want to, quote unquote, do my own research and construct my own narrative that reflects my own reality and so on and so forth, okay? So what does the liberal tradition, or could the liberal tradition, make of what appears to me, and I may be wrong, a fundamental shift from the material to the symbolic as a basis of contemporary politics?
That's a very good question. And the answer to that, I think, is unfortunately, it'd be very difficult, right? One of the things that I point out in my book, drawing on people like Sheldon Wolin, for example, is that as rich a normative tradition as liberal socialism is, and I think it's a very rich normative tradition, it has very much struggled with incorporating a critique of, let's call it ideology, or to use the Jamesonian term, postmodern culture into its conceptual apparatus. Now, I think that things are improving somewhat recently. I mean, a lot of the liberal theorists today, at least, are tentatively interested in critical theory in a way that they maybe weren't when I was coming of age. But there's a very, very long way to go, right? In terms of the kind of more general argument that you're making there about why Trump voters seem very attracted to symbolic rather than material victories, I think that there are many things that can be said. I'll just limit myself to two, right? So a lot of my earlier work focuses on a critique and analysis of what I call postmodern conservatism and the postmodern epoch, right? Very heavily influenced by people like David Harvey, Frederick Jameson, all the great Marxist critics, and Wendy Brown, can't forget her. And one of the things that Jameson in particular points out is under postmodern cultural conditions, it's very difficult to actually imagine there could be substantial material changes, right? We've reached this kind of epoch where many are convinced that we've reached the end of history in terms of institutional reform and transformation. Almost everyone is convinced that plutocracy is either the future or it's here right now. There's no getting away from that. And in those kinds of circumstances where one is struck by the closedness of the future, it shouldn't be a surprise that a lot of people turn to this kind of Benjaminian instinct to say, well, we'll turn society into a kind of entertainment for itself, which, of course, he said was at the latent root of the appeal of fascism in the 1920s. The second thing I'll say is maybe a little bit more germane to your comments about material interests, right? So Vivek Chibber has written some very good work on how classical Marxist theory is wrong to suppose that the workers have nothing to lose but their change, so they might as well just do a socialism or do a communism, right? He points out that actually even something like unionizing in a neoliberal epoch brings with it extraordinary risks, as we all know, right? You can try to unionize at a Walmart, and then very quickly they'll fire you for eating half a banana, right? And those kind of circumstances, you might sit there and say, as a worker, why would I take the risk of unionizing, right? That brings with it enormous potential costs to me. There's no clear gain at the end, right? So better just to kind of keep your head down and do what the boss said. And this is always an argument that really resonates with me, right? I was a cashier for 7 years at a grocery store. Nice enough boss, right? I don't have any kind of things to say against him. But I'll tell you, there was somebody who came in once suggesting that we unionize, and they could not have gotten her out of the door more quickly, right? It was just in and out. And then immediately they had a big meeting and they said, look, we understand that you want to unionize. We understand blah, blah, blah. But if you do that, then the whole place is going to go under. It's terrible advice. Don't do it. And then there was kind of a subtle threat that was baked in there. Right? That's a lot of pressure to deal with.
And so I guess, well, I'll go back to something I read in the New Yorker, which pertains to this in a certain way. I don't remember if it was Adam Gottlieb or somebody else, right? You can make what you think is a material gesture. I'm gonna invest some money in your town. I'm gonna fix up the hospital. Okay. Wow. Who doesn't want to have a better hospital? Okay. Who doesn't want to have better roads? Who doesn't want to have buses? Okay. And this author was pointing out that, well, in some parts of the United States, that material gesture will be read in symbolic terms. It will be read as a symbolic humiliation, right? I don't want your damn government. making my roads. I'd rather drive a miserable road, right, than be dependent upon. By the way, in a lot of areas, like government is a distant thing, right? It's very hard to sell social democracy to people in rural northern Ontario because they know that whatever social democracy exists, it's not going to trickle down to them, right? The doctors will still all be in Toronto, right? So I suppose my question would be, or I don't know, maybe project is too grand a word, but there seems to be, I mean, a way out of this kind of dilemma by realizing that even material gestures can be symbolically given and symbolically received. And that's like the complexity of gift giving, right? How do you give a gift without humiliating the recipient of the gift? It's an age-old problem, right? Okay. Could you expand on that a little, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of a recurring debate that goes on within the socialist tradition itself, and is certainly characteristic of a lot of the critiques of socialism that people make, right? And you can go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, right, who was deeply concerned that the rise of what we now call social democracy is going to essentially infantilize the general public, right? They're going to have all their needs cared for. They're going to enter into a kind of premature dotage, playing video games and getting high, while the big state looks after them and not aspiring to do much more than that, right? Yeah. And I think that those are legitimate concerns, right? But I would say that a lot of the figures in my book are deeply aware of these concerns, and they do their best to kind of offset them. Just to give two examples, John Stuart Mill, right, who I call the first mature liberal socialist, was very critical of what we might now call statist versions of socialism for exactly the kind of reasons that you're mentioning. What he argued for was a kind of workplace democracy, worker co-ops, to supplant the capitalist-dominated firms of his time. And he even gave these kinds of let's call them macho reasons for that. Mill was a feminist, but he wasn't above it, right? He said, look, a real man should not want to bow and scrape to a boss any more than you want to bow and scrape to a lord, right? Sure. And that's what we have characteristic in the capitalist system overall. So rather than having a workplace setting where you have to bow and scrape and bow brown nose to the boss, instead, workers should manage the firms for themselves. And, they'll do that democratically and they'll be involved. And he thought that this would be morally uplifting. Ethically uplifting is probably a better way to put it, right? Yeah. Compared to what existed before, while at the same time being efficient, right? So I think that Mill is very concerned with that, right? Another example would be Rawls. Rawls was very often criticized exactly along the lines that you mentioned, right? That what he wants is a kind of nanny state that's going to look after everyone, at least in urban areas, to your point, right? And no one's going to have to do anything for herself. Well, I think that that's quite wrong, right? The third part of a theory of justice, which Rawls himself said was the part of the book he was most proud of, is in many ways a defense of what he calls the Aristotelian principle, right? This idea that the development of our human capacities is a very, very great good, and the development of higher order capacities is a far greater good than the development of lower order capacities. And to give his famous example, none of us would really applaud someone for getting really very good at counting blades of grass on the field, right? But you would really applaud somebody for becoming a great violinist or a great musician, unlike somebody like me who just was musically talentless, apparently, despite many stabs at it, right? Unfortunately, right? So I think that all these authors are cognizant of those concerns, and the theories that they offer are intended to address them systematically. Although, of course, how that would look in implementation, how we can secure equality and flourishing for everyone without leaning into dotage, right, is a practical question that I just don't really address that much in the book.
And I guess to move on to what I suppose my final point is, we're sitting in a place here, well, what is it, about a quarter of the people here claim some sort of indigenous Mi'kmaq heritage. They do, now, there's a fundamental resistance from people in that community to the notion that, well, the primary function of a state is to secure the flourishing of individuals, because their outlook on the world is fundamentally more communitarian than that, right? So they have ideas of flourishing as a community, as a culture, as people. And by the way, in Canada, right, I mean, I suppose, as opposed to the United States, we have an official policy of multiculturalism. And this is not a neutral procedural policy in the sense that, like American liberal theorists like to talk about. Multiplicity, diversity, multiculturalism has been embraced here as an inherent public good, to the delight of some people and to the horror of other people. And that's how it goes.
I remember when Justin Trudeau, back in the day, if anyone remembers him, said, Canada is the first post-national. Right here. Said Canada was the first post-national state, right? And I remember the National Post published op-ed after op-ed by Conrad Black and everyone being like, no, absolutely not. We're good English / French, people.
Sure. But people from that end of the argument or that end of the spectrum, and it's slightly like the problem of like environmental rights, right? Does a culture have status, right? In terms of its having rights and so on. Does a river have status, right? There seem to be attempts to move beyond this classical liberal notion of individual flourishing towards various kind of communitarian or identitarian forms of flourishing, and even involving things like ecosystems at some point, right? So I was wondering what your particular political project would have to say to that kind of concern.
Well, I would say that most of the figures that I talk about in the book don't address those issues directly, and where they do, the results often aren't good, right? Just to give an example again, one of the things that I point out, drawing upon Charles Mills, is that liberal socialism can very much be implicated in a failure to take seriously questions of racial justice, or they were actively participants in defending things like British imperialism in Mills's case, right? So I think that there's a lot of work that would need to be done in order to extricate a liberal socialism that was committed to things like racial justice, equality between cultures, that kind of thing. Now, saying that, I definitely don't think that that's an impossible project, right? Just to kind of answer your question with a few ideas of my own. I think that Will Kimlicka and James Tully, the great Canadian constitutional theorist, have shown how it's very possible to have a more community-minded liberalism that is not only respectful of difference and tolerant of difference, but actually embraces it even at a constitutional level, right? Recognizing that we can have a legally pluralistic society rather than having a monological legal system where the state kind of imposes one way of life and one legal framework upon everybody, right? Now, I don't really have a lot that's written about this myself, right? The closest thing would be a book I wrote with Dr. Les Jacobs on Ronald Dworkin's constitutional theory, where I address some of these things in an American context, right? But I see no reason why it is that a good liberal socialist political theory that was properly developed can embrace things like constitutional multiplicity via Tully, and certainly not. It would certainly be very comfortable with multiculturalism along the lines of Will Kimlicka, for example.
But I suppose the stumbling block here would be Quebec. Province of Quebec, where we have an official policy, laïcité, if I'm saying that correctly, according to which everybody in the public service has to appear as quote unquote neutral. Okay, except the neutral thing you're supposed to appear as is a white Christian, right? Quebec. So it's not neutral at all, right? Neutrality. Involves taking off your turban or taking off your hijab or all these kind of marks of difference in the name of a kind of universality, which is actually a kind of particularity. Okay, and I mean, I don't know. Do you talk to political philosophers in the French Canadian tradition and what they might have to say about this?
I'm sorry. I had a review of Gerard Bouchard's Interculturalism, A View for Quebec, that came out a couple of years ago, co-authored with my friend Connor, who unfortunately passed away recently. But what I argue in that book is that the kind of conceptual apparatus that underpins the Quebec approach is what Gerard Bouchard characterizes as interculturalism, right? This idea that space is going to be created for cultural difference, but there's going to be a dominant culture that will impress itself using state mechanisms upon the general public, right? And I personally think that this is a mistake, right? The kind of view that I would support would be one which is much more multicultural rather than intercultural, in the sense that the state wouldn't require or mandate the adoption of any kind of shared cultural practice.
So you can wear a hijab, that's your own choice, but if you do, you can't teach in a school. So the state directly impacts your career prospects and your financial prospects based upon your religious identity. And of course, the situation now is, well, Quebec has to appeal to the notwithstanding clause to override the Canadian Charter to enforce that kind of vision. Okay? And like, I agree with you, every Anglo bone in my body is horrified by that kind of statism, but at the same time, there are people who perceive things like language as a fundamental public good. Mm-hmm. Like I don't, but there are those who do, right? And do you see a ready resolution of that kind of ideological clash?
No, I'm not sure that there ever will be a kind of a priori set of rules they can come up with that will just readily solve all these issues. Just to give a kind of good example, there was a case a couple of years ago that came before the Supreme Court surrounding Loyola High School, where my dad went to school, actually. And, what this involved was the Quebec government required, again, that schools adopt a neutral approach when teaching religion. The idea being you can't indoctrinate people into your religious faith, even if you're a Catholic school like Loyola. Well, the school and other religious schools push back on this by saying, well, we are a Catholic school, so clearly we are going to insist upon the truth of Catholicism when we are teaching religion, right? We're not going to sit there and imply that Catholicism operates on an equal level with Islam, Judaism, et cetera, et cetera. Why would we do that as a Catholic school? And the SEC actually agreed, right? They said, look, the reality is if you're a religious educational facility like Loyola or like a Jewish school or like an Islamic school, you should be able to teach that your religious viewpoint is the correct one. Now, saying that, the compromise that was made is that they will teach the other religious traditions from a respectful standpoint, while also implying that from their viewpoint, these religious views are, of course, wrong or contrary to the true revealed religion. Well, that's not a great compromise. But
it's a doable compromise. I mean, because this is Canada's a country of compromises, right? I mean, we just all kind of muddle our way through stuff.
Yeah, exactly right. I kind of agree with Tyrion Lannister from Game of Thrones, where he says, look, sometimes the best compromise is one where everyone is a little bit unhappy, right? Because it means nobody got everything that they wanted, but everyone got a little bit of what they wanted, right? But again, I don't think that you can come up with a decision like what you see in Loyola by applying a priori rules. One of the things about compromises, and this is something that Tully talks about very effectively, is you kind of have to work it out and talk about it and see what people are willing to give up and what they're unwilling to give up.
But now down south, we have the problem that, let's put it this way. Certain people in the United States seem to be so given to certain kinds of ideological abstractions, right? Like, my freedom is like I so support freedom that I would freeze in the dark for freedom, right? I'll be free freezing in the dark, or I'll be free dead from an AK-47 or whatever, right? And that's not a society, if I look at it right now, that seems primed on either ends of the ideological spectrum to start making compromises. That's why we hate those slimy politicians in Washington. They're always doing deals. They're always compromising their principles. They're always being Republicans in name only or Democrats in name only. And I guess I'm not in the United States, but I have to wonder, is that so ingrained in the national character down there that, dare I say this, the country is doomed?
Well, I don't think the country is doomed. I do definitely think that there is a kind of agonistic dimension to American politics that has always been here, right? And I think that this has been papered over by a lot of ideological mechanisms, none of which are particularly convincing, right? Just to give one example, Professor Rana has released a very good book called The Constitutional Bind for University of Chicago Press. It's about 800 pages, right? And he talks about how the country has long been defined by what he calls a kind of creedal constitutionalism, right? This idea that we might disagree about a lot of different things, but the Constitution is what binds us all together, and we should revere it. And any kind of political disputes should take place via constitutional style language. But what Rana points out is, by many metrics, the American Constitution was transparent failure, right?
Sure.
And very few people actually historically have ever agreed about what it says, and very often they don't like what's actually in the Constitution. More or less, the Constitution was enacted in order to bring the Union together. A lot of compromises were made with institutions like slavery. And as Rana points out, it really only lasted in its original form for about 70 years. So about a lifetime.
And
right?
by the way, compromises are not always good. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Right. And then a big civil war broke out. 600,000 to 1 million people died, and they had to rewrite the whole thing anyway. Right. So I think that not only does this demonstrate the kind of agonistic dimension of American politics that has always been present, it also demonstrates, certainly according to Rana, that the ways they try to paper over this by saying, well, this will all unite us, just aren't really very convincing narratives either, right? So in terms of is the country doomed, I really don't know. I hope not, since I live here.
I mean, we all hope not, because, it'll drag us all down with it. But, I don't know. Did you want to ask a question?
Sure. Hey, guys, I really appreciate it. I'm curious to bring it back to your book, if I could, Matthew. So I'm kind of interested in the kind of left reception of your book. And like, I know Jacobin, there was a review of your book by, I believe, Paul Schofield, who was pretty, like, overall, he was pretty much enjoyed your book, and he seemed to appreciate what you were doing in terms of trying to reinvigorate that kind of tradition, which can unite this kind of left liberal tradition, like intellectually. But one of the main criticisms, the only perceived criticism I could see was that some people might see, oh, are we talking about socialism here, since there's not an actual economic dimension, like explicitly in your emphasis at least. So what would you say to that, and how do you think your book was broadly perceived on the left?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned this. Right? I talk about this in the introduction, right? When I announced that I was writing this book on Twitter, I got an awful lot of people write me angry messages. And the people who were most angry of all, oddly enough, were the kind of neoliberal types, everybody who had, Hayek or Milton Friedman avatar, and the tanky Marxists, right? The kinds of people who are like, socialism means Marxism, means Marxist-Leninism, nothing else. And so, I took some pride in saying, wow, I brought these two people who hate each other, these two groups that hate each other, together in animus towards me. But I also noticed that there were a lot of people who wrote to me saying, look, I think I actually might be a liberal socialist because I like many parts of liberalism, but I'm also committed to a kind of socialist project. I just don't know whether that's true yet. What do you think, right? So that encouraged me to think, like, well, maybe there is an audience for this book who, like me, is kind of perturbed by the fact that many of us on the left have deep criticisms of liberalism, while at the same time we like the idea of rights to freedom of religion, rights to freedom of assembly, certainly rights to freedom of expression these days in an academic context, right? My hope was to kind of address them by pointing out that there is a tradition of liberal socialism out there from which one can draw if one is committed to these things together. In terms of the kind of practical dimensions of my project and how socialist it is, it's not something, as I mentioned, or as you mentioned, that I talk about a lot in the book. And I think that's a weakness of the text. Now, in my defense, I claim in the book that this is a retrieval, not a defense, right? So I'm talking about other people's visions of liberal socialism, not necessarily my own. My own vision of liberal socialism would be much more kind of Rawlsian Marxist take than what you see before. Definitely a lot more Marxist. But in terms of, how this cashes itself up practically, I've usually pointed to things like a radicalized version of the Nordic model as what I'm aspiring to, right? Now, some people question whether the Nordic model can be accurately called socialism. But I would point out that, important historians like Sejerstedt have talked about the Scandinavian variant of socialism. There's a new book that came out recently by Pelle Dragstedt on Nordic socialism. And, the point, as Scott Sahan points it, is however you want to characterize it, these countries are a lot more socialist than we are. And they're very successful, so we should probably do some of what they're doing. Now,
although we all read in Stieg Larsson that, there's a seedy underbelly to those societies too. But
yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, you're going to get murdered by, one of the oligarchs there, in a secret murder dungeon. But I point out that, look, even in the Nordic states, there were attempts to push this model forward, and I think that that's what we should do. A good example would be in Sweden under Olof Palme. The Meidner proposal that was put forward was intended to give trade unions and workers control of the industries that they worked on. And notably, this was the kind of last straw for Swedish capital, where they're like, we're happy with being taxed very heavily to pay for the welfare state, but we're not going to allow the workers to control the business. I would want us to adopt something that looks like the Nordic model and then try to implement something like Meidner type reforms to move towards something that's a more comprehensive economic democracy. So that's kind of how this is intended to cash itself out, at least in my understanding.
So maybe I'll just ask a specific practical kind of question.
Sure.
Now, people tend to identify capitalism with markets, but of course, markets are much older than capitalism.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you've got markets in the, the Sumerians have markets, right? So just practically speaking, what is the status of what we have come to call the free market, the freedom to buy and exchange and sell and so on, in a liberal socialist vision that, right, admits that there's certain kinds of decisions that individuals will just be taking for themselves. How much am I going to charge for this Coke over here or whatever, right? So maybe like one place to start would be elucidating that.
Sure, it's a great question. So all the authors that I talk about in the book have very different understandings of the role markets are to play. So I'll talk very briefly about them, and then I'll get into my own kind of vision of this, right? Is that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. Sure. So, I mean, obviously, John Stuart Mill was an advocate of what's now called market socialism. The idea was that, of course, there are going to be markets, there'll be competition. This is necessary in order to facilitate innovation. But he said, by and large, firms should be governed by workers, and the market should be accompanied by a very robust welfare state that will kind of offset some of the negative externalities and the inequalities that emerge, right? So that's one vision of the role markets intend to play, workplace cooperatives in place of capitalist firms. Others, like, say, John Rawls, envision a much more kind of pluralistic approach, right? Where he thinks there are large spheres of the economy that probably can and should be decommodified, healthcare, education, housing, etc. There are roles that markets can play in other spheres when it comes to things like consumer goods. But again, this should be offset by transition to more worker-oriented firms accompanied with that robust welfare state that we're talking about before, right? My approach, again, drawing upon Pelle Dragstedt in his new book, Nordic Socialism, is to emphasize a kind of experimentalist, even kind of Deweyan approach to the economy that's inherently pluralistic, right? I don't have a problem with markets playing a role in a good society as long as, to evoke Rawls again, the most important and essential goods are decommodified, and consumer goods will preferably be delivered by worker-owned firms and worker-controlled firms. And if there are contemporary or things that look more capitalistic, those firms themselves will also be much more democratic.
Okay. So I suppose my next practical question would be concerned with property, right? So, for instance, we all recognize, I think, that there is a moral significance to property in relation to things like personal effects. Like, that's my photo album there, right? But of course, we have a legal system where, somebody owns a McDonald's, I guess, and there is no effective stake in the McDonald's. There is no relation of the McDonald's to memory or tradition or family or anything that gives the property in question moral or spiritual or personal value of the person, right? I'm sometimes tempted by the notion that, maybe McDonald's is not property at all in any meaningful sense, is it? I mean, if you burn down a McDonald's, what's the tragedy?
Well, the tragedy, I worked at McDonald's for 2 years, is that
well, the tragedy is the people who work there, No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, the tragedy is that women's lipstick will get a lot more expensive, because what I learned when I was working there is that the grease pit, L'Oreal and other companies will go and suck that up and use it as thickener and makeup products.
So it's a node in a system in some sense. And so it has significance in that way.
Well, in terms of the kind of broader, more seriously, the question about property, right? All the liberal socialists that I talk about emphasize just what you did, right? That personal property is something that we have very good reason to respect, right? Nobody wants the state saying, you don't live in your house any longer, right? Because your house is the people's house. Nobody wants, the state coming and taking your car or your photo album or whatever. So personal property should be considered sacrosanct. What the authors that I'm talking about are concerned about is private ownership of the means of production, or as it's sometimes called, the commanding heights of the economy. And they vary at around what threshold personal property transforms into private ownership of the means of production. That's sufficiently plutocratic so that it can facilitate various forms of domination. And, I think that there's always going to be penumbral questions about where the line can be drawn between personal property and, again, the commanding heights of the economy. I don't think it's a one and done thing that you can settle. But I'll just tell you a little story, right? So one of the great critics of socialism is Robert Nozick. right? Everybody knows him for his book Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is a classic work of libertarian philosophy that everyone should read, right? And in this classic book, he lays out a thought experiment, the Wilt Chamberlain thought experiment, where he says, look, you have Wilt Chamberlain, who's a great basketball player. You start off in a condition of pure economic equality, and then everybody wants to see Wilt Chamberlain play basketball. They put a quarter in his little box before each basketball game, and he gets rich. Why should the socialists want to redistribute Wilt Chamberlain's money? He didn't hurt anybody, and everybody freely gave him his money. Now, I think that a lot of socialists would have some problems with it, but not so much because of the story that Nozick tells. What they would be concerned about is what happens after Wilt retires, when he decides, I'm going to buy a factory in the town because I can't play basketball any longer. Then I'm going to grease the local politician with some of my money. And then when my workers want to organize a union in my factory, I'm going to go to that politician and say, hey, remember I gave you that big donation a couple of years ago? Well, it's time to pay up, and I want you to pass ordinances that'll make it really, really hard for my workers to unionize, or even allow me to fire them vicariously, right? Because I just don't really want that in my factory. That is a serious problem, right? And the reality is, unfortunately for Nozick, it's much more emblematic of real existing capitalism than the cute little fairy story he tells about Wilt Chamberlain, right? So personally, I don't have a problem with Wilt-type scenarios as long as they end with somebody making a little bit more money because they're playing basketball, right? I do have a big problem with Wilt Chamberlain 2-type stories, and I think any socialist, and indeed any liberal, should.
So, I mean, we might say, for instance, that Wilt Chamberlain is a remarkable enough individual that we can say that in some sense, Wilt Chamberlain has exhibited a kind of excellence in athletics, which, back to the ancient Greeks, that's a form of excellence, which merits a significant reward. And so the question would be, well, why can't that significant reward be monetary? And up to a point, yeah. But but I suppose what you would say, we don't want Wilt Chamberlain buying a TV station.
No, that's exactly it. So I want to point out that, again, the different authors that I've foregrounded in the book differ on their approach to issues like meritocracy and desert, right? So just to give one example, John Stuart Mill, again, is very critical of some of the arguments given by capitalists to suggest that capitalism is a meritocracy, because he says in his chapters on socialism, look, I hear 1,000 times a day that hard work should be the basis of reward, right? And that people who do essential jobs should get rich on that, right? And what Mill says is, if you actually took that seriously, the coal miners in industrial England would be extremely rich, and all the kind of boobs who inherit a lot of their money would be extremely poor. We don't have that. So he says, even according to the logic that's often put forward to defend capitalism, we should be more socialistic.
Well,
right?
If you're in the class of CEOs, you can fail over and over and over, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's golden parachute after golden parachute. And I want to point out things are a lot worse now than they even were 70 years ago, right? CEO pay used to be about 22 times higher than what workers got. Now in the United States, the last time I looked, it was 344 times higher, right? So
but they're not 24. They're not 24 times better.
Yeah, I know they're not. And I very much doubt that any CEO is working 344 times harder than the guy working in his factory, right? But, my own approach to this is a lot more Rawlsian, right? Which is problematic for some people, but I think it's true. Rawls is very critical of the idea that you can even have anything that looks like a meritocracy ever. And he points out, I think quite rightly, that the idea of meritocracy, oddly enough, is quite a utopian one in some respects, right? It's this idea that we can design social institutions so that everybody gets what they deserve. Well, Rawls and other Rawlsians have pointed out that this is such a utopian idea that even the religious authors of the medieval era wouldn't buy into it, right? Because they'd say, look, if you want a society where everyone's going to get what they deserve, you got to wait to heaven, because human society is never going to approximate that. So it's very odd that us so-called rationalists and realists nonetheless believe that anything like a meritocracy could be possible in this world, right? As a kind of Rawlsian from a normative perspective, I think it makes a lot more sense to talk about what people need and what's fair, rather than questions about what people deserve and how we can try to give people what they deserve. I just don't think that you're ever going to have a society that will approximate that even in an infinitesimal way. And I should add, it's not just Rawlsians that have pointed this out, right? Hayek made exactly the same claim in his critique of socialist arguments for the labor theory of entitlement.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you have a high school talent contest, the popular, nice-looking kid will win. And it's not right, because and if you let his peers judge or her peers judge, or even if you let parents judge. So, I mean, we all recognize that under the guise of meritocracy, all kinds of mediocrity is rewarded and extended limitless tolerance and so on and so forth, right? So we all know it's kind of a sham, right? I mean, are the kids from Harvard really the smartest kids? Well,
well, certainly they think so, right? But I'd like to point out that, again, there's a lot of studies that are done on this, right? Just give an example, Michael Sandel, the Harvard political theorist, kind of knocked his own institution when he pointed out that if you look at the background of students that go to Ivy League schools, only about 2 to 3% of students who go to Ivy League schools come from the bottom quarter of American families in terms of income and affluence. About 75 to 80% come from the top quarter, and of those, overwhelmingly, the most students at Ivy League universities come from the very, very rich families, right? Which makes sense when you think about legacy appointments. And Sandel's point is, you call this whatever it is that you want, right? But it's clearly not a meritocratic system, because if you're able to get into an Ivy League school much more easily because you come from a very rich family, or even if you work hard, but your family gives you a lot of resources, private tutors, et cetera, that's clearly not a fair competition, right?
And by the way, when you're there, they have a special grade for you, right? The gentleman C. Like, it's assumed you get a C, right? Which means you're not a serious scholar in any sense, but we can't fail you because your daddy's rich, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? And you see this all around, right? And interestingly enough, you've seen some of the more intelligent conservative authors acknowledge that point, where they've said, look, we need to stop, this is again Hayek's point, where he points out, we need to stop talking about capitalism as some kind of meritocracy, because every time we do, inevitably the socialists are going to come along and start saying things like, well, if the workers are working a lot harder than the rich, why is it that they're not rich, right? Or, more basically, it becomes very obvious that there are all kinds of features of a capitalist society that don't accord with meritocracy, right? People get all kinds of unfair advantages and disadvantages from birth onwards. And if you were really a meritocratic society, you would need to radically reconstruct and correct for those, right? In a way that Hayek thinks is just completely unpalatable, right? So I think that at some point, what people are just going to need to realize is what I mentioned before, that meritocracy is a utopian dream, not even a very attractive utopian dream, as far as I'm concerned. And it's time for us to kind of wake up from it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it was, who was that guy? Robert Bjork or something?
Oh, Robert Bork,
Bork. Yeah, not Bjork. Bork, right. I got him confused with the Icelandic pop singer there for a second. No, he essentially said that equality of opportunity, right? The catchphrase is, well, we believe in equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And he said, well, equality of opportunity would be, essentially a statist project. The state would have to interfere massively to make sure that people actually got equal opportunities, because in life they don't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, think about, the Sandel example, right? If you were really saying that life is going to be a competitive race and a fair race, then you need to bring everyone to the same starting point on the line, right? Otherwise, people are going to rightly complain, well, that guy was 200 yards ahead of me, and I was 200 yards behind the starting line, and I had a lead backpack, right? So again, it would entail this massive commitment to reconstruction. And again, I don't think that the outcomes, even if we did engage in this, would be particularly desirable, right? So I think if you're going to offer a defense of market society, which plenty of people do quite effectively, think about Hayek and Nozick again, right? It's needed to be on premises that are not meritocratic. But I think that a lot of people struggle with that for the reasons that Max Weber was cognizant of all the way back in the 20th century, when he pointed out, look, early 20th century, the reality is that you very rarely, if ever, find a ruling class that's as content with just being a ruling class. They always need to provide some justification for why they have earned their position, with the more toxic inversion being, of course, they need to provide a justification for why the swinish multitude, to use Burke's term, are where they are.
And so that's the distinction between, hardworking Albertans and lazy Eastern Canadians.
That's right.
Because Albertans,
we're supposed to freeze in the dark.
Yeah. Well, if they're convinced of one thing, I mean, the right-wing ones, it's that they've earned something, right? Something fundamental to their prosperity and success as a society is down not to luck, not to circumstance, not to fate, not to providence, but through their own, theologically speaking, they're Pelagians, right? They believe that the universe runs on a principle of merit, and they have earned the respect of others, In fact, they've even earned the deference of others by being more hardworking than everybody else, which, you know.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I lived in Mexico for a couple of years. And my response to those people is usually like, go talk to any 40-year-old housewife in Mexico who's working 40, 50 hours a week, earning, $100, a month, and tell her, how hard you've worked and how hard you struggled, right? And she'll probably have some strong words for you, right? But, again, I think that a lot of this is theoretically besides the point, even if to your observation, psychologically, it's extremely difficult for a lot of us to give up on meritocratic ideas, right? Because I think for a lot of us, we are the hero of our own story.
Hero of our own story, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We're the
in which case that, if I'm, say, head of the Conservative Party of Canada, there is no universe in which I don't have to pander to that kind of sentiment. Right? If I try to critique or problematize that kind of sentiment in any way, shape, or form, my voters would abandon me.
Absolutely. And actually, this is one of the reasons for the appeal of conservatism, right? So my earlier work, as I mentioned, was on postmodern conservatism, and I had a book that came out about 2 years ago called The Political Right and Inequality, which people can check out if they want. But very briefly, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, well, why is conservatism or the political right appealing to people? Why aren't people committed to liberty, equality, and solidarity for all? And my response to that is there's an enormous amount that's extremely appealing about right-wing thought, not just in kind of its intellectualized form, but at a very core level. Because ultimately, the right is committed, to use high extreme, to this idea that there are recognizably superior people in society, and those recognizably superior people are entitled to more of everything, really, more wealth, more power, more agency, etc. And when you pitch that to the general public, it's very easy to say you are a part of this recognizably superior group of people. So any selfish thing that you happen to do is something that you're actually allowed to do on the basis of your superiority. And it's only the envious, lazy, and resentful others who are there trying to take what's yours from you, right? What you've earned. And very appealing narrative.
Not only in conservative circles, just watch academics circling around a pool of grant money, and you find that thinking is exactly the same. I'm the person who deserves that. In fact, I deserve more than my colleagues. I should get merit pay, which, thank God, we don't have up here. Which is founded on the principle that I'm a more successful researcher, I'm a better teacher, I am more successful in grant applications. Therefore, I deserve some kind of special recognition from the university that my chicken shit colleagues know, right?
Oh, absolutely right. Again, we're all the hero of our own story, right? And just to kind of lean in on hypocrisy a little bit. I mean, I've had those sentiments before. I'm sure you've had. It's a very human thing. I've encountered arch Marxists, right? Who are, the kinds of people who will open every book with, we have it in our power to change the world, who will jealously look at every citation they get, compare their citations to everyone else, and talk constantly about, as you point out, why they should be entitled to more grant money, et cetera, right? I think that, a certain low level of hypocrisy on these kinds of things is just intrinsic to human nature, even if I think in a better society, the more vulgar instantiations of this would be ameliorated. I hope.
But how are we for time there, Jordan?
Yeah, we're coming up again the hour. We just want to thank you, Matt, for coming on our podcast and kind of getting into some of this. Just for our listeners, it's a very systematic book and occasionally very funny, actually.
Nice.
Yeah, which I liked. Is there anything else you'd like to promote? What's on the horizon? Are you writing a new book with Ben Burgess, is it?
Yeah, that's right. So Dr. Burgess and myself have organized an essay collection with a lot of Canadian contributors, actually. Les Jacobs, Christine Sipnowich, Ego Shukabad, who's from the Marathons. And, it's reintroducing analytical Marxism and G.A. Cohen's work, right? So, I have an essay in there that talks about how liberal socialists might respond to Cohen-esque style socialists, democratic socialists. Ben has some really interesting stuff on Karl Marx's theory of history. We have libertarian authors like Chris Freeman, who offer critique of Marxism and socialism as a whole. So, the other side is represented. And we're really excited about that. I think it should be coming out in December, January, is what I was told. We'll see.
All right. And any new articles I see here? Liberal currents, Rawls in the street.
Yeah, I have a few articles that'll be coming out. So I have a piece coming out in Jacobin soon on, of all things, it's Cormac McCarthy, actually.
Wow.
I'm a big fan of his novels, and I decided, it's summertime, let's try something a little different, right? But I have an article coming out in a collection on McCarthy's politics that's a little bit more academic. I have some new stuff coming out for liberal currents on the far right, actually. So I had a piece that came out on the far right canon, right? The major intellectuals in the classical far right canon. And, a lot of people were like, very interesting, et cetera. But who are the current people? So I was like, well, fine. You'll want a sequel. Here's a shameless sequel to that piece. Okay. It's 4,000 more words. And I got some other stuff that's coming out too that should be of interest if people like my work.
Thanks. Dr. Matthew McManus, Associate Professor at Spelman College. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay.